Alright, now we're moving to part 2 of life at the turn of the 20th century, or the emergence of modern U.S. So we're starting with section 3, which is about segregation and discrimination. So around the turn of the century, in the 1880s and 90s, southern states adopt a system of legal discrimination where African Americans have to deal with voting restrictions, Jim Crow laws, Supreme Court setbacks, and physical violence. So what is discrimination? Well, discrimination involves several things. One, beliefs, where a group is people they believe is inferior because of something. Emotions, I hate this group of people. And then, of course, there are actions where I will deny opportunity / hurt, kill members of this group. All southern states will impose new voting restrictions to deny legal equality to African Americans. Some states limit the vote to those who could read. Other states will create a poll tax that you'll have to pay prior to voting. Southern states are going to pass segregation laws to separate white and black people in public and private facilities. These laws came to be known as Jim Crow laws, and it's named after an old minstrel song. So racial segregation will be put into effect in schools, hospitals, parks, and transportation systems throughout the South. Restrooms, everything. Eventually, a legal case will reach the U.S. Supreme Court to test the constitutionality of segregation. And in 1896, the Plessy versus Ferguson, the Supreme Court ruled that the segregation of races was legal and did not violate the 14th Amendment. Basically, they said they could be separate as long as they were equal. Well, they weren't equal. They had to be, if you had two schools and they were segregated, they're supposed to be just as good as the other. But they weren't. That was another problem. Alright, race relations in 1900. Black Americans face legal discrimination as well as informal rules and customs that are meant to humiliate these rulers. Include whites never shaking the hand of an African American. Black African Americans had to yield the sidewalk to whites. Black Americans had to remove their hats in the presence of whites. Alright, violence. African Americans who did not follow the racial etiquette could face severe punishment or death. And between 1882 to 1892, more than 1,400 black men and women were shot, burned, or lynched. Lynched is basically dragged out and hanged. The peaking of lynching was in the 1880s and 90s, but it will continue well into the 20th century. Here are the major areas of lynching. Now, discrimination in the North is going to be very different. While most African Americans will live in the segregated South, many African Americans will migrate north in hopes of better jobs and equality. But the North have its own brand of racism, where black Americans get low-paying jobs and live in segregated neighborhoods. There's one example of the Chicago race riot. Whereas the men and women are working, white and African American men are working in the same factory, but African American men get paid much less in Chicago than the white man. Discrimination in the West was also different, and it was mainly geared more towards Hispanic and Asian immigrants. Mexicans were often forced into what is called debt peonage, which is a system of forced labor due to debt. Asians were increasingly excluded from mainstream society. Section 4, Dawn of a Mass Culture. Many middle-class Americans will fight off city congestion and dull industrial work by enjoying amusement parks, bicycling, tennis, and spectator sports. American leisure was developing into a multi-million-dollar industry. Amusement parks. So to meet the recreational needs of city dwellers, Chicago, New York City, and other cities began setting aside land for parks. Amusement parks were constructed on the outskirts of cities. These parks had picnic grounds and a variety of rides. Spectator sports became popular. Americans not only participated in new sports but became avid fans of spectator sports. Baseball and boxing became profitable businesses. Mark Twain called baseball the very symbol of the booming 19th century. Newspapers, mass production printing techniques led to the publication of millions of books, magazines, and newspapers. Joseph Pulitzer and William Randolph Hearst were two leading publishers whose competition led to more and more sensational newspaper reporting. Some contend that Hearst and Pulitzer's yellow journalism will be responsible for the Spanish-American War in 1898. That's a talk for another day. So promoting the fine arts. By 1900, free circulating public libraries will be numbering in the thousands, and by 1900, most major cities had art galleries. In the early 20th century, the Ashcan School of American Art will paint urban life. Here's an example. This is Dempsey and Firpo by a 1924 artist, George Wesley Bellows. Here's another work that was unsigned in 1930. We also have popular fiction. Alright, dime novels were popular and inexpensive. They were focused mainly on adventure tales and heroes of the West. So some readers preferred a more realistic portrayal from authors like Mark Twain, Jack London, and Willa Cather, and those three were probably the three most popular writers of the day. Mark Twain is considered one of the greatest American authors. Growing consumerism. So the turn of the century will witness the beginnings of the shopping center, department and chain stores, and the birth of modern advertising. The department store. Marshall Field of Chicago brought the first department store to America. Field's motto was, "Give the lady what she wants." Field also pioneered the bargain basement concept. And Marshall Field's has been around for almost 150 years. Chain stores. In the 1870s, F.W. Woodworth found that if he offered an item at a low price, the consumer would purchase it on the spur of the moment. And by 1911, the Woodworth chain had 596 stores and sold $1 million per week. Advertising. Expenditures for advertising was under $10 million a year in 1865, but increased to $95 million by 1900. You see ads everywhere in newspapers, magazines, and of course billboards. And finally, catalogs and RFD. Montgomery Ward and Sears were two pioneers in catalog sales. By 1910, 10 million Americans will shop by mail. And in 1896, the post office introduced a rural free delivery system that brought packages directly to people's homes. All right, and that is the end of our lesson.